Right now, we're debating a lot about whether companies should be bailed out or whether they should be allowed to fail. I'm going to take a look at the potential effects each way has in order to argue that no company should be allowed to develop into a moral hazard. Hi everybody, welcome back to the Contrarian Investor channel. My name's Logan. I like to talk about investing and overall success, so if you like those topics, please hit the subscribe and like buttons down below. It just helps me to keep making content like this. A moral hazard is essentially a company that has the reassurance of government support behind it and thus does more risky behavior than it normally would. So Boeing would be a prime example of this right now with all of the share buybacks that they've spent their profits on in the last few years. And just being really badly prepared for this crash. Any sort of recession would have sent them to this position that they're in now, needing government support. And investment banks like Goldman Sachs and Bank of America are really good examples from 2008 of companies that were bailed out but would have gone bankrupt if they had not. It's also important to realize in 2008 a few companies were allowed to go bankrupt. Stearns and Lehman brothers were allowed to fail. But AIG, the insurer behind all of the trashy CDO mortgages, was bailed out for $180 billion. And it's really important to emphasize that the government cannot create money out of thin air. Nothing can create money out of thin air. It has to always take it away from the taxpayer or the consumer in some way. So in this case, in 2008, it was taxpayer revenue that went to bailing these companies out, and also money printing. And that has only escalated in 2020. Now we're talking about trillions versus hundreds of billions. So it's an order of magnitude more that we're needing to talk about now. So it keeps increasing in severity. Probably about 10 times worse than in 2008. And back in 2008, the majority of the companies behind the CDO crisis, CDO stands for collateralized debt obligation. Most of these companies were bailed out, and this resulted in zombie companies. And zombie companies are essentially companies that are only alive because of government taxpayer money going to them. And it did not have to change anything fundamental about their business. So this is a really bad thing to have in your economy. It's essentially just telling businesses that they can make bad decisions and be bailed out for it. I understand that a lot of people tend to argue that this puts a lot of people out of work, and this is definitely true. Temporarily it would result in a lot of pain, but I would argue that in the long term it would result in a lot better health for the economy if you have companies being responsible with the profits that they make, with the decisions that they make, with the management that they have. They really need to be focused on surviving regardless of what happens, regardless of whether the government will bail them out. And where this leads to right now is where the government is talking about another $3 trillion in stimulus after $2.2 trillion, as opposed to a total of $700 billion back in 2008. So we could see, over $7 trillion, probably maybe even $10 trillion at the end of this crisis. Who knows how much they'll end up printing and putting stimulus money in. It's almost like universal basic income, UBI, is being tried out right now. But the only thing is it's not being called UBI, it's just being called, the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, or any of these other programs, the sending out the stimulus money, the $1,200 to a select group of citizens. It's not going to everybody, so it's definitely not comparable to UBI, but in other words, the problem has only escalated. So the government went from bailing out just a select few businesses, and now it's having to bail out, most businesses and the consumer. So it's very clear that the government is very fearful of allowing the system to fail at this point. The trouble is, at some point it will fail. It's like a balloon. It can only hold a finite amount of air before it pops. No balloon can expand indefinitely. And letting it pop or fail when it is small is much less dramatic than when it is overfilled and just pops due to some random incident. And that's what we had in 2008. We had a disease spread, and we had a shutdown as a result of that. it's debatable as to whether that shutdown was actually warranted, in my opinion. Maybe not, but that's a whole different subject. And that really, we had the best economic numbers in history, basically, of unemployment rates for just about any group of people. And that went from the best employment numbers in history to, comparable to the Great Depression in a matter of a few months. So that just shows you how fragile our economy was at that point in time. So I want to kind of argue that this shouldn't be the case. Let's compare the health of an economy to the health of a forest. And so in a forest, if no forest fires are allowed to happen and any lightning strike that causes one is put out, then the trees grow tall, old, and dead growth builds up. And this can lead to mega-scale fires that wipe everything out. And these are fires that nobody can control. They're just going to rage and rage and rage until they burn everything to the ground. But if, on the other hand, wildfires are allowed to naturally burn parts of the old forest at a time, you have a much healthier pattern of smaller ups and downs in the forest growth. Also, in old forests, no small plants on the ground can survive since no light gets to them. And so similarly, in a constantly bailed out economy, only the giant companies can survive, such as, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google. These are the companies that are really, really benefiting and expanding right now because of all the bailout they've received. But the small businesses all get wiped out. They don't receive much of this stimulus money, and when they do, it really doesn't make a dent in their operating costs, and they usually get it too late. It doesn't really make a difference, and this is really, really disturbing because, as you probably know, small businesses make up a very large percentage of the employment in the economy. It's not all the S&P 500 companies. It's not, the FANG companies. They definitely don't do that. It's the small businesses. Jobs are getting wiped out right now because of that. And let's look at Yellowstone National Park. So they had a fire in 1988 that was the largest one in recorded history in the park. And up until then, it was thought that all wildfires must be prevented in a national park. But this, of course, allowed large growth in deadwood to build up. And when the fire did happen, it was devastating, and people thought Yellowstone National Park would never recover. At the time, they were saying that, oh, this park is kind of dead. It'll probably never recover. And now, 32 years later, it is more healthy than ever with the new growth. It's definitely more healthy than it was before the fire happened, when there was all this old growth built up. And now they allow fires to happen. They've learned their lesson. They allow forest fires to naturally happen within reason. They will stop them if they, endanger people's lives or they come close to property within the park. But they generally now allow wildfires to happen in the park. And I think that's a really good thing. So what does this all mean? I think hopefully big businesses will be allowed to fail at this point. Obviously, we've seen that the government's kind of trying to bail them out now again, so I don't know if they will be allowed to fail, but I'm hopeful that maybe the economic machine will kind of almost force them to fail. I kind of find it, discouraging that they would be allowed to recover again this time, at the expense of the taxpayer and the consumer. However hard this might be, people losing their jobs and, really falling into a depression kind of era, I think that it would really be beneficial long term. This also says that the government cannot pick and choose who wins and who loses. This is definitely not capitalism. And I think this is really why you're seeing a lot of people actually accepting socialism as an alternate form of, an economy. And obviously socialism has a much worse historical record than capitalism, but I think socialists are right to point to the system we have today and say that it's broken. It's definitely, definitely broken. So I think that this is really why you're seeing this rise in young people, especially my age, who, have grown up and seen a lot of crony capitalism. They've seen the dark side of capitalism, and it's really not capitalism, to be honest. But we need to get rid of crony capitalism. We need to learn and get back to the true definition of capitalism, from the 1950s era that allowed the United States to become the powerhouse that it was at that time, the innovative, the industrial powerhouse that it was. It might take time, but this is definitely possible. And yes, if you like this video, please subscribe and hit the like button, and leave a comment down below as to what you thought about it and what topics you would like to hear. And yes, I hope to see you again.